My name is Karen Whitfield. I'm 33 years old. And the Tuesday afternoon I learned my brother and sister had held my father's estate meeting without me and told me it was on Thursday, was the afternoon I finally understood that being trusted with something and being credited for it are two entirely separate transactions, and my family had only ever intended to offer me one. I found out from a neighbor. His name was Franco Dia, and he had lived 3 houses down from my father on Sycamore Hill Road for 14 years. He was the kind of man who noticed things without being nosy about them, who was home which cars were parked where, whether the mail had been collected. He called me at 4:18 on a Tuesday afternoon to offer his condolences again, the way people do in the weeks after a loss when they think of you and pick up the phone, and he mentioned in passing that it looked like the family had gathered today, quite a few cars. He hoped things were going all right with everything that needed sorting. He said it the way people say things they assume you already know. I told him thank you. I told him things were progressing. I ended the call and set my phone on my desk and looked at the window across my office, where the afternoon light was coming in at the low angle it gets in October, and I kept my hands in my lap and let the information settle before I did anything with it. I did not drive to my father's house. I did not call my sister. I did not call my brother. I sat at my desk for 11 minutes, and then I called the office of Margaret Chu, the probate attorney who had been handling my father's estate since his death 6 weeks earlier, and I left a message with her assistant asking her to call me when she had a moment. Then I opened my laptop and continued working because there was a brief due the following morning, and the work did not stop being due because my family had done something I needed to think about carefully before I responded to. Margaret Chu called me back at 5:40. What I told her made her quiet for a moment in a particular way, the quiet of a professional who has heard something that requires a specific kind of attention. She asked me 2 questions. Then she told me she would handle it and explained what that would look like. I thanked her and ended the call. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not contact either of my siblings that evening. What none of them knew, what they had not thought to verify before they spent 2 hours in my father's living room distributing his belongings by verbal agreement, was that my father had named me executor of his estate 18 months before he died, in a will drafted and witnessed at Margaret Chu's office, and that I had been issued letters testamentary by the county probate court 8 days after his death. Those letters were a court document. They meant that I, and only I, had the legal authority to manage, distribute, or authorize the transfer of any asset in my father's estate. Every agreement my siblings had made that afternoon was made by people who did not have that authority. Every decision was void before they made it. They had divided a table they did not own. Let me tell you who my father was, because the story only holds its shape if you understand the man at its center. Raymond Whitfield was 67 years old when he died of a stroke in late August. He had been a civil engineer for 31 years, the kind of man who kept his files in labeled binders, his tools on pegboard outlines in the garage, and his accounts in a ledger he updated by hand every Sunday evening. He was methodical in the way that people who have spent their careers managing infrastructure projects become methodical. He understood that systems fail when people assume rather than verify, and he had applied that understanding to every domain of his life, including, as it turned out, the organization of what he would leave behind. He had 2 adult children besides me. My sister Diane is 38 and has always occupied the particular position that oldest daughters occupy in families like ours, the one who is consulted, deferred to, assumed to be managing things, whether or not she is actually managing anything. She lives 20 minutes from where we grew up, runs a boutique home staging business that does well enough to afford her a certain confidence, and has always related to our father's life as something she had significant authority over by virtue of proximity and personality. She is not cruel in intention. She is accustomed to being in charge and has never been asked to examine that assumption closely enough to understand where it stops being warranted. My brother Todd is 36. Todd is easier to describe. He follows Diane. Not because he is without his own opinions, but because following Diane costs him less than disagreeing with her, and Todd has always been good at calculating costs. He was our father's favorite in the way that youngest sons sometimes are, the one our father coached in Little League, took to football games, taught to change oil in the driveway on Saturday mornings. Todd understood this, and wore it comfortably. He would tell you that he and Dad were close. They were in the way of shared activities and easy affection. What Todd did not do was manage anything. He showed up. He was present and warm and helpful in the moment. He did not make appointments, fill out forms, or sit in attorneys' offices for 2.5 hours reviewing the implications of estate planning documents. I did those things. I have always done those things, and the reason I did them is both simpler and more complicated than it looks from the outside. The simple version: I am the one in the family who reads the paperwork. I became a contracts manager at a commercial real estate firm 8 years ago, and before that I spent 4 years as a leasing coordinator, and before that I spent 2 years as an administrative assistant at a law firm where I learned, among other things, that most family disputes that end up in legal offices began as conversations where someone assumed and nobody wrote it down. I read documents. I ask follow-up questions. I call back when I say I will. These are not exceptional traits. They are ordinary professional habits that, in a family where nobody else has cultivated them, become a kind of invisible infrastructure. The complicated version: I was not the favorite. Diane was the authority. Todd was the warmth. I was the competent one, which is a role that gets filled and then forgotten about, the way you forget about load-bearing walls until something structural shifts. My father loved me. I am certain of that. And the will is a form of evidence, though I did not know at the time he drafted it how specifically he had chosen to express that certainty. But in the daily texture of our family life, I was the one who handled things, and handling things is a job that generates completion, not acknowledgement. You do it because it needs doing, and when it is done, the conversation moves on. My father's health had been declining since a minor cardiac event in the spring of 2 years ago. Nothing sudden, a gradual narrowing of what he could do comfortably, a series of adjustments, a long, slow change in the quality of his days that required ongoing management from people who could sit with him through appointments and understand what the doctors were actually saying. I was that person. I drove him to the cardiologist, a physician named Dr. Anand Mehta at Riverside Medical Center, 12 times over 18 months. I sat in on conversations with his primary care physician, Dr. Louise Fenwick, about medication adjustments and monitoring protocols. I coordinated with his home health aide, a woman named Charlene Rivers, who came 3 mornings a week and who I spoke with by phone every Friday to understand how his week had gone. Diane visited every few weeks and made dinners she photographed for her social media. Todd came when he could and fixed things around the house that my father had stopped being able to fix himself. Neither of them attended a single medical appointment. Neither of them had the name of his cardiologist, his primary care physician, or his home health aide in their phones. I am not saying this as an accusation. I am saying it as a record. In February of the year before he died, my father asked me to drive him to an appointment he was vague about. This was not unusual. He had become somewhat private about certain things as his health changed, and I had learned to drive him to appointments and ask questions only when he opened the door. We went to the offices of Chu and Barnett Estate Planning on Whitmore Avenue. I parked in the structure across the street. I sat in a waiting room with a collection of framed botanical prints and a side table of magazines from 3 months ago and waited for 2 hours and 40 minutes while my father met with Margaret Chu. When he came out, he was carrying a manila envelope. He looked, not lighter exactly, but resolved, the particular expression of a person who has finished a task they had been avoiding and found it less difficult than they feared. In the car, he said, "I needed to update some things." I said that seemed like a good idea. He said, "You'll know what to do when the time comes, Karen." I said I would do my best. He said, "I know." We drove to a diner he liked on Prescott Street, and he ordered the meatloaf and I ordered the turkey club, and we talked about a road project near his house that had been going on for 3 months and showed no sign of finishing. He handed me the manila envelope before I dropped him off. He said to put it somewhere I would be able to find it. I said I would. I drove home and placed it in the fireproof document safe in my home office, in the section I kept for important papers, and I did not open it. I want to be precise about why I did not open it. It was not in curiosity. It was that my father had not asked me to read it, only to keep it safe, and those 2 instructions felt meaningfully different to me. I trusted him to tell me what I needed to know when I needed to know it. He had been doing that my entire life, giving me information in the right sequence at the right time without excess. I extended him the same courtesy. The envelope stayed in the safe for 14 months. My father died on a Sunday morning in late August, quietly, in his own house, with Charlene Rivers present. I received the call at 7:22. I was at his house by 8:45. Diane arrived at noon. Todd arrived at 3 in the afternoon with his wife and their 2 children, which filled the house with the specific organized chaos of people who mean to help and are not sure how. I had already spoken to the funeral home, the county vital records office, and Margaret Chu's office before either of them walked through the door. I opened the manila envelope that evening, alone in my father's study, while my siblings managed the logistics of dinner in the kitchen. The will was 14 pages, drafted with the specificity I would have expected from a man who labeled his file binders and updated his ledger every Sunday. He had left the house to all 3 of us in equal thirds, with provisions for a 12-month period before any sale could proceed. He had left specific personal items to specific people. Todd got the tools, Diane got the china, I got the engineering reference books and the Sunday ledger, which I understood, and which made something tighten in the back of my throat in a way I did not examine immediately. And on page 7, in language that was straightforward and unambiguous, he had named me executor of his estate, with full authority to manage, distribute, and administer all assets according to the terms of the will. I read that page twice. Then I put the will back in the envelope, went to find Margaret Chu's business card in my wallet, and sent her an email at 9:17 that evening introducing myself as Raymond Whitfield's daughter and informing her of his passing. She replied at 7:00 for the following morning. We had a phone call that afternoon. The process of probate, the filing, the court appointment, the letters testamentary, took 8 days, which is efficient, and is efficient because Margaret Chu is good at her job and because I provided every document she requested within 4 hours of the request. I told Diane and Todd that I had been named executor. I told them at the kitchen table at my father's house, 3 days after his death, while we were working through the immediate logistics. Diane said, "That makes sense." Todd said, "Okay." Neither of them asked what that meant in practical terms. Neither of them asked to see the will. I noted this and did not press. We had more immediate things to manage, and I assumed, incorrectly, as it turned out, that the practical implications would become clear naturally as the estate process moved forward. What I did not anticipate was how quickly and completely they would forget. 6 weeks after my father's death, I received a text from Diane at 8:14 on a Monday evening. It said, "Estate meeting Thursday, 2 p.m., Dad's house. Margaret's assistant will send the agenda." I replied, "I'll be there." I received no agenda from Margaret's assistant because Margaret's assistant had not been involved in scheduling this meeting. I did not know that yet. On Tuesday at 4:18, Franco Duya called. The meeting my siblings had held was not a formal probate proceeding. It was not a meeting with Margaret Chu or any attorney. It was Diane, Todd, Todd's wife Melissa, and Diane's husband Carl, sitting in my father's living room with the contents of his house spread across their attention, and an informal list Diane had written by hand of what should go where. They had a verbal agreement about the furniture. They had a verbal agreement about the timing of the house sale. They had discussed and apparently reached a consensus on the question of which real estate agent to use when the 12-month hold period ended, a conversation that involved a specific agent named Phil Garrett at Westside Properties whom Diane had worked with professionally. Todd had said, at some point in the afternoon, "Should we call Karen?" And Diane had said, "Karen always complicates things. Better she stays home." Todd had not pressed the point. I know all of this because Todd told me, approximately 3 weeks later, when he was ready to be honest about what had happened. I am not going to characterize his decision not to press the point as a moral failure. I am going to characterize it as a choice that had consequences he had not thought through, which is a different thing and a more accurate one. After Franco Duya called, I sat at my desk for 11 minutes. I considered what I knew and what I didn't. I considered the difference between what my siblings had done, which was meet without me, make verbal agreements, and plan things, and what those agreements actually meant in the context of an estate in active probate with a named executor holding letters testamentary from a county court. I arrived at the same legal conclusion Margaret Chu would arrive at 45 minutes later, but I called her to confirm it because I had learned, through 8 years of contracts work, that your own legal conclusions are worth more after a licensed attorney has reviewed the same facts and reached the same result. Margaret Chu's conclusion, delivered in the calm and thorough manner I had come to associate with her in 6 weeks of working together, was this: Karen, every verbal agreement they made this afternoon is unenforceable without your authorization as executor. They cannot agree to sell the house, select a real estate agent, or distribute personal property outside the terms of the will without your sign-off. None of what happened today has any legal effect. I said, I assumed that was the case. I wanted to confirm it. She said, I'll send a letter to both of them tonight, on firm letterhead, outlining the executor's authority and the legal status of today's discussions. I'll copy you. I said that would be appropriate. She said, Do you want me to be direct? I said, Yes. She said she would handle it and that I should let her. I thanked her, ended the call, went home, made pasta with the jar sauce I kept for evenings when I didn't have the bandwidth for anything more involved, and watched television for an hour before bed.
I did not contact Diane.
I did not contact Todd. I did not send any message that evening to either of my siblings about what I knew or what was coming. Margaret Chu's letter arrived in their email inboxes at 7:52 the following morning. I have not read their immediate reactions in real time, because I was not there and neither of them called me that morning. What I know is reconstructed from Todd's account 3 weeks later and from the behavior I observed in the days that followed, which is its own kind of documentation. The letter was 4 pages. It cited the will by date and document number. It cited the letter's testamentary by court filing number and issuance date. It cited the relevant provisions of the state probate code governing executor authority. It stated, in language that Margaret Chu later described to me as plain and complete, that no distribution of estate assets, no agreement regarding the sale of real property, and no selection of service providers on behalf of the estate could proceed without the written authorization of the named executor, Karen Whitfield, and that any agreements reached without that authorization had no legal standing. It also stated, in the final paragraph, that Margaret Chu represented Karen Whitfield in her capacity as executor and that all future communications regarding the estate should be directed to her office. Diane called Margaret Chu's office at 9:15. Margaret Chu was unavailable. Diane left a message. Margaret Chu returned the call at 2:30 and the conversation lasted, according to Margaret's assistant who logged it, 22 minutes. I was not told the contents of that conversation in detail. What Margaret told me was, she understands the situation now. Diane called me at 4:45 that afternoon. It was the first call I had received from her since the text message on Monday evening telling me the meeting was Thursday. She said, Karen, I think we need to talk. I said, I think so too. She said, I didn't know you had that kind of authority. I said, I told you I was executor at Dad's kitchen table, 3 days after he died. There was a pause. Not a long one. She said, I didn't understand what that meant. I said, I understand that. She said, I wasn't trying to cut you out. I let that sentence occupy the space between us for a moment. Then I said, what you were trying to do and what you did are 2 different things, and I think you know that. You scheduled a meeting on Tuesday and told me it was Thursday. Another pause. Longer this time. She said, I thought it would be easier to get aligned first and then bring you in. I said, aligned on what? These are Dad's assets. The will says what happens to them. There isn't an alignment step before that. She said, I know. I said, I'm not interested in making this harder than it needs to be. I am interested in doing this the way Dad set it up to be done. That means everything goes through me and through Margaret. If you want to discuss the furniture, the timeline, the agent, I'm available to have those conversations. But they happen with me in the room. She said, okay. I said, is there anything else you needed to cover today? She said no. The call ended. It lasted 9 minutes. Todd called the following evening. His call was different in texture, less formal, more uncertain. The voice of someone who had been thinking about something since the previous morning and had arrived at a place he wanted to say out loud. He said, I should have called you Tuesday. I said, yes. He said, when Diane said you'd complicate things, I should have said that wasn't the point. I didn't. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry, Karen.
I said I appreciated that.
I meant it. There is a difference between an apology and an explanation, and Todd had offered an apology, which is rarer and more useful. I told him that I wanted to move through the estate process cleanly and that I would make sure he was included in every step from this point forward, the same way I would include Diane. He said that was more than fair. The call lasted 16 minutes and covered, in its second half, the practical question of when we should schedule a formal meeting with all three of us and Margaret to review the estate timeline. We agreed on the following week. I hung up and sat for a moment with the phone on my knee and thought about my father at the diner on Prescott Street eating meatloaf and talking about the road construction, and something in the center of my chest settled in a way it hadn't since August. The formal estate meeting happened on a Thursday, the Thursday that had originally been given to me as the date for the meeting that had actually happened on Tuesday, a coincidence I noted privately and did not mention aloud. It was at Margaret Chu's conference room on Whitmore Avenue, around a table that seated 8 with 4 of us at it. Margaret, me, Diane, and Todd. Margaret had printed copies of the will and a 1-page estate timeline she had prepared, which outlined the probate process, the 12-month hold period on the property, the expected timeline for asset distribution, and the steps required for each. Diane sat across from me. She was composed in the way she is always composed, put together, present, the version of herself that she brings to professional settings. She had a notepad. She took notes. She asked 3 questions, all of which were reasonable and which Margaret answered thoroughly. She did not look at me directly for the first 20 minutes of the meeting, and then she did. And when she did, I held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at Margaret, because there was nothing useful to say with an expression that wasn't better said in words, and we had already had the words. Todd asked 1 question about the personal property that had been informally discussed at the Tuesday meeting, specifically the furniture, and whether any of those verbal agreements could be documented and formalized. Margaret said that personal property distribution, provided it aligned with the will's terms and had the executor's written consent, could be handled by a signed personal property memorandum, which she could draft. I said that was fine with me and that I would review the list Diane had made and come back within 2 weeks with any questions. Diane said she would send me the list. She sent it that evening. It was organized by room, typed, and included the market value estimates she had looked up for each item. It was, I have to say, thorough. In the months that followed, the estate moved forward the way my father would have wanted it to, methodically, without drama, with every step documented. Margaret managed the probate filings. I signed what needed signing, reviewed what needed reviewing, and authorized what was authorized. The house went to market 14 months after my father's death, listed at $418,500 with an agent named Patricia Ewan at Harborview Realty, whom I had selected after reviewing 3 proposals. Phil Garrett, whom Diane had proposed at the Tuesday meeting, was one of the 3 I considered. He was not the one I selected. Diane did not comment on this. I think she understood by then what comment would mean. The house sold in 23 days at $411,000, which was within 2% of list and which my father, who had always tracked property values in his Sunday ledger, would have considered a satisfactory outcome. The proceeds were distributed according to the will. 3 equal portions. 3 wire transfers. 3 bank confirmations sent by Margaret's office on the same afternoon. Diane texted me when hers arrived.
She said, "Received."
"Thank you for handling everything." I replied, "Of course." It was the most direct acknowledgement I received from her for the 11 months of work that the estate had required, and I decided it was sufficient, not because it was everything I might have wanted, but because wanting more from that particular source had always cost me more than the return. There is a photograph of my father in his study, taken sometime in the late 90s when I was a child, in which he is sitting at his drafting table with a set of engineering drawings spread in front of him and a pencil behind his ear and the expression of a man who is entirely at home. He is looking at the drawings, not at the camera. Someone, I think my mother, had taken the picture without him noticing. You can see on the drafting table, to the left of the drawings, a labeled binder and a coffee cup and a small framed photograph that I can't quite make out. I have that photograph in a frame on my desk now, next to the engineering reference books he left me in the will and the Sunday ledger, which I have not written in but have not put away. I think about what my father understood when he made his appointments and updated his documents and handed me that manila envelope in February and said you'll know what to do when the time comes. I think he understood something that I had not yet fully understood about myself at the time, which is that the ability to manage things, to read the paperwork, show up to the appointments, ask the right questions, keep the record is not a supporting role. It is the role. It is the thing that holds the other things in place, and the people who do it are not background characters in someone else's story. They are, whether or not anyone has thought to check the documents, the ones in charge. My father thought to check the documents. He updated his Sunday ledger and labeled his binders and sat in Margaret Chu's office for 2 hours and 40 minutes and came out carrying a manila envelope and handed it to me in the car and said you'll know what to do. He was right. Not because I had read the envelope. I hadn't, not until I needed to, but because I had been doing the thing the envelope described for as long as I could remember, and he had been watching, and he had written it down. Being prepared is not the same as being ready. Ready implies anticipation, a waiting for the moment. Prepared means the work was already done before the moment arrived. My father prepared me, and I prepared myself, and when Tuesday turned out to be Thursday, preparation was enough. You do not have to announce what you have built. You do not have to argue for access to rooms where decisions are being made about things you are already authorized to manage. You show up to the appointments. You keep the documents. You put the envelope in the safe. And when the moment requires someone who knows what to do, you already do. The work you do quietly does not disappear. It files itself. There is a moment from the Thursday meeting at Margaret Chu's office that I want to tell you about, because it is the one I have returned to most in the month since. We were near the end of the meeting, reviewing the timeline, and Margaret had just finished explaining the property sale process, the hold period, the listing authorization, the executor's sign-off at closing. She turned to Diane and said, "Do you have any other questions?" And Diane said, "No, I think I understand it now." And then she looked at me across the table and said, "You've been doing this since the day he died, haven't you?" It was not a question the way she said it. It was a recognition. A sentence arriving after the fact at something that had been true the whole time. I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't see it." I said, "I know." Margaret gathered her papers. Todd asked about the parking validation. The meeting ended. We walked out into the hallway and rode the elevator down together in the particular silence of people who have said the things that needed saying and are now standing in an elevator. If you have ever been the one who did the work that nobody thought to count, kept the paperwork, made the appointments, understood the documents before the room needed them, I want to know, was there a moment when someone finally saw it? Not thanked you, not necessarily, just saw it. Understood what had been there the whole time. Leave it in the comments. I read them. If this story stayed with you, a like and subscribe help more people find it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'm Karen. Thank you for being here. I think about what my father understood when he made his appointments and updated his documents and handed me that manila envelope in February and said you'll know what to do when the time comes. I think he understood something that I had not yet fully understood about myself at the time, which is that the ability to manage things, to read the paperwork, show up to the appointments, ask the right questions, keep the record is not a supporting role. It is the role. It is the thing that holds the other things in place, and the people who do it are not background characters in someone else's story. They are, whether or not anyone has thought to check the documents, the ones in charge. My father thought to check the documents. He updated his Sunday ledger and labeled his binders and sat in Margaret Chu's office for 2 hours and 40 minutes and came out carrying a manila envelope and handed it to me in the car and said you'll know what to do. He was right. Not because I had read the envelope. I hadn't, not until I needed to, but because I had been doing the thing the envelope described for as long as I could remember, and he had been watching, and he had written it down. Being prepared is not the same as being ready. Ready implies anticipation, a waiting for the moment. Prepared means the work was already done before the moment arrived. My father prepared me, and I prepared myself, and when Tuesday turned out to be Thursday, preparation was enough. You do not have to announce what you have built. You do not have to argue for access to rooms where decisions are being made about things you are already authorized to manage. You show up to the appointments. You keep the documents. You put the envelope in the safe. And when the moment requires someone who knows what to do, you already do. The work you do quietly does not disappear. It files itself. There is a moment from the Thursday meeting at Margaret Chu's office that I want to tell you about, because it is the one I have returned to most in the month since. We were near the end of the meeting, reviewing the timeline, and Margaret had just finished explaining the property sale process, the hold period, the listing authorization, the executor's sign-off at closing. She turned to Diane and said, "Do you have any other questions?" And Diane said, "No, I think I understand it now." And then she looked at me across the table and said, "You've been doing this since the day he died, haven't you?" It was not a question the way she said it. It was a recognition. A sentence arriving after the fact at something that had been true the whole time. I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't see it." I said, "I know." Margaret gathered her papers. Todd asked about the parking validation. The meeting ended. We walked out into the hallway and rode the elevator down together in the particular silence of people who have said the things that needed saying and are now standing in an elevator. If you have ever been the one who did the work that nobody thought to count, kept the paperwork, made the appointments, understood the documents before the room needed them, I want to know, was there a moment when someone finally saw it? Not thanked you, not necessarily, just saw it. Understood what had been there the whole time. Leave it in the comments. I read them. If this story stayed with you, a like and subscribe help more people find it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'm Karen. Thank you for being here.